In this video, we'll take a quick look at a few functions that Houdini provides us with that allow us to read input from the user and display information back to them. These functions can be very useful for giving the user cues or telling them what exactly is happening in the script if they're not completely aware of what's going on. Now, in order to access any of Houdini's native functions that allow us to interact with Houdini, we use this module that we use this Python module called Hoo, H-O-U. So if you type HOU dot, you'll see that there are a huge number of functions and enumerations and classes and things that Houdini uses to allow you to control the way that it works through Python. The one that we'll be looking at specifically in this video is Hoo.ui. So if we type Hoo.ui and then type dot, you can see that UI has a lot of functions in there that allow you to control the user interface of Houdini in various ways. The one that we want to look at in this video first is display dialog, or display message. So if we click on that one, we can hit open parenthesis, and this shows us a nice help for that. Basically, display message just pops up a quick dialog that allows us to give some information to the user. So if you do an open quotes, and then type some message, say, hi user, close quotes, close parenthesis. If I hit enter now, this dialog pops up that says whatever message I told it to display. This can be very useful for displaying confirmation dialogues or for just displaying a dialog that tells the user that whatever the script is doing is done. Now, note that display message can also be used to read limited input from the user, and we can do this through the use of buttons. So if I say Hoo.ui.display message, just hit tab, open parenthesis, I give it some text like make your choice user, and then do a comma, you'll notice that the second argument that display message is expecting is buttons. And buttons is just expecting a list of button names. So if I say something like Blorg, Fawn, Zorg, and close the bracket. Notice that I'm just giving it a list here, in the same way that we defined lists in the Python overview. And then I can close the parenthesis. And now if I hit enter, you'll notice that in addition to the message that I'm giving it, it also has 3 buttons. And when I click one of these buttons, you can see that it returned the button that I clicked. So if I do it again, and I click Blorg this time, it returns 0. If I do it again, and I click Zorg, it returns 2. So the way to think about this is it's going to return a number starting at 0 and counting up from left to right. So Blorg is going to be 0, Fawn is going to be 1, and Zorg is going to be 2. And if you notice, this is actually the element in this list that I gave it. So if I hit Fawn, you'll see that it gives me 1, which is element 1 in this list. So I can see the label of the button if I just define the list ahead of time. So if I said something like spam, or let's actually even just use buttons equal Blorg, Fawn, Zorg, close bracket, print buttons, and then we say Hoo.ui.display message, open parenthesis, make your choice, comma, and then I say buttons, close parenthesis. And then I'm actually going to dump that value into a variable, so I can say spam equals, and I say enter. Make your choice, I'm going to choose Zorg. So now if we print spam, notice the spam is set to 2. So if I say print buttons, open brackets, spam, I can get the label of the button that I actually clicked on. This can be great for giving users very quick and simple choices like, are you sure you want to continue, or something like that. If we want to read more complicated input from the user, there's another dialog that Houdini provides us with to do this. So what we can do is we can say spam equals, because it's just going to be returned from the dialog, who.ui. And then if you scroll through there, or if I even just type read, you can see there's this read input dialog. So if I click on that, open parenthesis, you can see that the arguments for read input are very similar to the arguments for display message. The first argument is the message that you want to give the user that tells him what he's actually entering. So if I say, in quotes, give me a number, put a colon there just for fun, close quotes, and then I'll just close parenthesis for now. If I hit enter, it gives me this little dialog. And here's the text that I told it to use as the prompt. And if I click in here, I can give it some number, say 60, and hit OK. And now if I print spam, you can see that it returned 2 values. So the reason for this is that you're actually clicking a button. So if I run this again, you can see that I clicked this OK button. So if I give it 60 again and hit OK. So 0 is telling me that I clicked the OK button, and there's only one button, so it's always going to be 0 if I use this type of code. But let's look at what can happen if we give it something else. Let's say we give it some buttons. So we say buttons equal, and for the button names, we'll just give it OK, and then cancel, close parenthesis twice, and hit enter. You'll notice that now there's 2 buttons. I can give it a number like 60. And now if I hit cancel, and I print spam, it still gives me the number that I entered, but now I know I hit the cancel button because it gives me this 1 here. And this works the exact same way that, if I go back and bring up the dialog again, that the display message worked, where it's the element number of the button that you clicked on. So OK is 0 because it's element 0 of this list, and cancel is 1 because it's element 1 of this list. So just to make sure that that works, if we hit OK, we'd expect it to be 0 because it's element 0 of this list of button names that we gave it. If we hit OK, we say print spam, you can see that indeed it is 0. So you could check this number to determine which button that the user clicked. So if the user clicks cancel, you don't have to do anything. Now you may have noticed that earlier when I was typing these arguments, the video kind of jumped and we ended up with 2 lines here instead of 1. And I wanted to leave that in because I want to show you kind of a trap that I even fell into, which is not closing off the elements of your list. So what I did before, if we look, you can see that there's no quotes there. And this means that we're only giving Houdini one button name, essentially. Houdini is going to interpret this in a very interesting way, and this is kind of a Pythonism. So if I hit enter, look what happened. Instead of just getting one button, we got a whole bunch of buttons. Why? So the reason why that happened is because what I'm giving it here, instead of a list, is actually what Python calls a tuple. And the difference between a tuple and a list is that a tuple can't actually be changed after it's defined. Now, practically speaking, for you as a beginner, this probably isn't going to come up very often, but just remember that tuples are what's called immutable, which means that you can't change them after the fact. You can only redefine them. Now, the syntax for using a tuple is if I say something like buttons equal, and then you use parentheses instead of using the square brackets that we use for lists. For a tuple, it's a parentheses. And then if I print buttons, you can see that I have 2 elements there. Now look what happens when I simply remove the quotation marks from inside. So you would think this would be a tuple that contains one item, and that item is a string that's set to OK cancel. Now when I hit enter and I say print buttons, instead of being a tuple still, you'll notice there are no parentheses on the outside, which means it's just a string. This is because Python thinks that these parentheses are for order of operations. So it's thinking that I'm doing something like 5 plus 4 divided by 3. It thinks that I'm trying to do something like this instead of defining a tuple. So what I can do instead, if I want a tuple with only one element, is just say buttons equals OK, and then put the comma after the quote, close parenthesis. This is a bit of odd syntax, but it basically just means, hey, I'm a tuple and I only have one element. If I say print buttons, you can see now that it's a tuple with only one element. So what I was doing before with this statement is I was giving it simply a string, and then Python was looping over each character in the string and setting each one to be a button, which is kind of funny. So if I wanted to actually have just one custom button, yay, button, after this quotation mark, but before the parenthesis there, I'd have to put a comma. And in that case, it gives me a yay button. So let's take a look at how to actually use this dialog in a more practical example. So for demonstration purposes, I'm going to want to actually use the Python source editor for this because we're starting to get into something that's a little bit more complex, and I'd like to be able to make changes without having to retype everything over and over and over again. So to get to the Python source editor, if you recall, we go to the Windows menu, and then we go to Python source editor, and that brings it up. Now if you remember how to define a function, since this is a module, we'll need to define a function to actually contain the code that we're actually going to be using. So we type def, def, and then I can just say demo, and then open close parentheses, and a colon. And that's our function. And then just to make sure that we understand what's going on, let's hit enter and tab, and then we can type something like print demo, hit apply. And then to use that in the Python shell, we just type who.session. And remember, that's the same name that's displayed here, who.session module. And then you can see that demo is there in the list. That's the function that we defined. So .demo, open close parentheses, and hit enter. And it runs the code in the function that says print demo, and there it is. Okay, so let's go back to our read input dialog. So first we want to define our buttons. So I'll say buttons equals, open parenthesis to make it a tuple, open quotes, OK, close quotes, comma, open quotes, cancel, close quotes, and then close parenthesis. And I don't actually need a comma here because I've already used at least one comma, so Python understands that it's a tuple, so I don't have to put a comma there. I can put it there, it won't hurt anything, but you don't need it, so I put it there. Alright, hit enter, tab out again. And then we want to store the output of who.ui.readInput in a variable, so we'll say user underscore input equals, and then who.ui.readInput. Okay. Open parenthesis. Our message is enter your favorite number. And then for buttons, we'll just give it that tuple that we have, so buttons. So now we'll hit enter and then hit tab again. And let's just print user input to make sure that we know what we're getting from the read input function. So if I hit apply, make sure you hit apply. I'll hit the up arrow to get who.session.demo back. Press it again. I'll enter ASDF and hit OK. And remember, this is a tuple where the first element in the tuple is the element number of the button that I pushed, and the second element in the tuple is the input that I entered. So in this case, I hit OK, so it's giving me 0, which is indeed the index number of the OK button element. So I can access that by just using my subscript. So if I say user input 0, I'll just print that. And I hit OK. You can see that it's printing 0. If I run it again and I hit cancel, you can see it prints 1, which is the index number of the cancel button. So now I can simply use this in a comparison the way that I'm used to. So if we delete that print statement, and then we say if user underscore input, and then I open square brackets, and I type a 0, and then close square brackets. So remember that when we have this user input 0, that's just what it's printing here. So that's the index number of the button that we clicked. And then we use double equals, because remember we have to use double equals when we're comparing two values. And then we just say 0. And we do a colon to close off the if statement. And then we hit tab twice, because remember, if we only hit tab once, it'll think that we're only part of this function and not part of the if statement. So if we hit it twice, Python then knows that we're part of this if statement. So if the user clicked OK is really what this is saying, then we want to print something like, hey there, you clicked OK. So we hit apply. Let's just test to make sure that works. So go back to who.session.demo, I'll click OK, and then it does it. If I hit the up arrow again and bring it back up again and click cancel, you'll notice that it does nothing. So let's just make it do something if we click cancel. So if we go back to the Python source editor, we can go down to the next line, hit tab, because now we're just part of the function definition and not part of this if statement anymore. We can type else, and now hit tab twice because we're part of this else statement. Say print you canceled. Hit apply. Now if I run the function, I click OK, it says hey there, you clicked OK. I run the function, I click cancel, it says you canceled. So now the last thing is, let's just make it print out whatever we entered in the read input, which is really the point of this whole exercise. So if we just replace this print where it says you clicked OK, let's have it if the user clicked OK, it'll print out the input. And if you remember over here where we were printing out just the results of who.ui.readInput directly, the second value is the value that we entered. So we can just access that with another subscript. If we say print user underscore input, open square brackets, 1, close square brackets. This is going to say give me the 1th element of the list, which is this value, which is what I entered. So if I hit apply, and then I run who.session.demo again, and this time I enter something meaningful. If I hit OK, it prints something meaningful. If I run the function again, and I type something not meaningful, and I hit cancel, it just says you canceled instead of what I entered. So that's the last function we'll look at in this video. We'll be examining a lot more functions in the who.ui module later in the course, but for now, just try to familiarize yourselves with both of the functions that we looked at in this video.